Welcome. My name is Frederick Douglass Dixon, and this is the First Amendment, Historically Speaking, our third episode. Again, we would like to thank Urbana Public Television for allowing us to forward what we consider to be esoteric information, hopefully raising the awareness of the masses of those who are watching, and hopefully you go into your community and raise the awareness. That is the idea. The aim is to expose. Well, I want to start today by saying this third week, as we have looked in past weeks, we'll cover another paradigm. The very first week we talked about historiosis and the difference between black studies and the study of blacks. Last week we talked about the Negro question and its impact, long-lasting. Today we'll talk about another coined term, or we'll talk about a paradigm that has been huge in the idea of shaping society. So today we want to talk about a crisis of identity. Anyone who understands that coined term is very powerful. Crisis of identity. We'll go right into it and we'll make sure that we can break these terms down using functional definitions and using those words from a group of folks who are a lot more intelligent than I am. So we'll look to the idea of Mr. Webster's dictionary to help us out as we sort this and come up with a functional definition. And then we'll look at the origin of the idea of the crisis of identity and the long-lasting effects that it's had and continues to have, and perhaps look to what will be a crisis in the near future and forward some solutions as well, because that's very much so important that we forward solutions. So again, when we talk about the crisis of identity, this has gone on with the black population, those of us who came here as slaves, since our very first intercourse with the wilderness of North America. So as you come to America as one in chains, in the holds of slaves, in the holds of slave ships as a slave, then you were transformed. That particular group was transformed from what they originally were to slaves, from human to subhuman. So when we understand what kind of systematic change that takes and those who were agents in this change, then we look at the long-lasting effects of that change, and we can look to our identity right now to answer some of the problems that we see within our society. And when we say the crisis of identity, we don't want this to be looked to as just one particular group, but for this very small time that we have together, we want to be very particular about looking at one specific group and then how it fits in the larger scale. So when we talk about the masses of blacks in America and across the globe throughout what we call the diaspora, we want to look at the crisis of identity. And various groups have researched the crisis of identity and the idea of what it means on a number of groups that were researched. And we want to be very specific when we talk about what a crisis means. And I'll go to Mr. Webster's 9th Collegiate Dictionary when he says its definition of a crisis is a condition or a state of instability or danger in a social, economic, or political or international affairs, leading to a decisive change, a dramatic, emotional, or circumstantial upheaval in a person's life, a sequence of events at which the trends of the future events, especially for the better or the worse, will be determined. A turning point. In that same dictionary, Mr. Webster defines identity as a condition or a character as to who a person or what a thing truly is, the essence of a person or thing, the condition of being oneself or itself and not the other. The sense of self providing continuity. As we look at this compound term, this is a very complex compound term when we look at American society and we look at the crisis that has taken place with the identity with blacks here in the wilderness of North America. So when we talk about a crisis of identity, a crisis is a problem. A crisis is something that comes to what we call a crossroads, and then after that, it won't be the same. An identity, well, we can just use the first two letters in identity, and it's been broken down to say ID. And if any of us have ever owned an ID, what goes on your identification card? Some of the things that are on your identification card in itself tells you what identification is to mean in some circumstances. First thing you have on your identification card is a picture of you. So there you are. It also has your name, where you live, perhaps your social security number, perhaps if you're an organ donor, perhaps the color of your eyes. So all of these things begin to systematically place you as an individual. It makes it very easy for one to identify you. And when we talk about a crisis of identity, then there's a problem with the way that a person looks at themselves. There is a quandary, there is a quagmire at how this person has been viewed by themselves. Now, as wise people, we know that there are just several underlying items or underpinnings when we talk about identification. Now, in American society, we have to identify with the idea of being able to speak English. Somehow, you have to be able to speak English. We also identify with the idea of a certain religion. And for the most part in America has historically been Christianity. When we begin to talk about other ideas and avenues of identity, how we dress, how we look, how we feel about ourselves. And to make this far more critical, then we have to look to the group who supplies and provides those parameters that will constitute what's important in identification. So now, as one who has been taught to research their researcher and what they have researched, we want to kindly go into the idea of identification and how it has accumulated, multiplied, and festered from the host society, which controls what it is that we read and what we think and those things that we feel are important, to where we are right now and what we'll hold in the future. So when identity is shaped and fashioned by those who possess power in any society, if you go back to biblical days, those who had power created the identity of what's good, what's bad, what's deviant, what is termed to be appropriate. So we are back at square one with the idea of labeling and the power of labeling. Now we want to tie this into identity when we understand that identity here in America has been controlled, created, and sustained by those who are in control of society, and those are a very small group. And we can look directly to a small group of those, and again, consider those to be white men. They have, since the founding fathers, controlled the idea of what identity was, who would be human, who would be looked to as less than human, and for a desired outcome. When we understand that identity has been a tool that has created societal norms, we have lots of problems with some of our young ladies looking to what Hollywood, what the fashion world has provided for them as far as an identity. Somewhat unrealistic, multiplies, festers exponentially when it comes to the black man, woman, and child here in North America and across the diaspora. But when you have been taught by a group what is important, and it's almost like taking a picture. If I were to take a picture in a room full of people and you happen to be on that picture, 9 times out of 10, when you got your hands on the picture, the first person you would look for would be yourself. We say that 9th time because there may be somebody that you wanted to see a little bit more than yourself. And some folks also have problems with looking at themselves as far as being photographed. But far more thematically, when you take a picture and you look to that picture, and that picture is used to set pace, it's used to create norms, mores, values, folkways, and you don't see yourself. You are erased from this picture. You do not find yourself at this table. You don't find yourself in this photograph. Then you're forced to look to someone else for your identity. You're forced to look to someone else to cling to. You're forced to look to another group to provide the parameters and the outcomes for a desired purpose. So when we understand, and I want to go back to what has been used in the past as definitions for these terms to make sure that we can get it correct, you all, because there's absolutely no value in misunderstanding. For clarity and depth, we'll use Mr. Webster's 9th Collegiate Dictionary again when we define the word white. Pure, free from blemish, innocent, without blame. The color of purity. Free from guilt or pollution. Innocent, pure, characterized by freedom, that which disturbs and the like, fortunate, happy, favorable. This is what we have been given for a definition. The last part of this definition that completes the idea of white is the opposite of black. Now, as we continue to use Mr. Webster's acumen to clear up and forward us functional definitions, we'll look at the word black. And it comes and it starts this way: very dark or gloomy, expressing menacing, discontent, threatening, sullen, foreboding, dismal, gloomy, destitute of moral light or goodness, atrociously wicked, cruel, mournful, horrible, death. These particular terms have played a role, and the way they have been forwarded for clear definition for society functions has weighed heavily upon both crowds. One crowd for an extended elevation and one crowd for decimation. So to make these definitions fall clearly upon how society has looked at it, well, when you don't mean to tell the truth but you hurt no one, you tell a little white lie. When you want to go to a wedding, you wear white. Angel food cake in itself is white. And then we look to when you go to a funeral, dress in black, goes back to the definition connected to death. Black male, black ball, black list. Devil food's cake is indeed black. We have for years lived by these parameters, legally, systematically. And right now, we look to these definitions to segregate thought, to provide a social function, to set the pace of how our children will learn. We're talking from the youngest. And as we talk about education, you all, if you understand the paradigm, the youngest is the most important. But what's more so important is what are we teaching the young? How are these myths passed along generationally if they're not discussed in the home? So when you see a young lady who is of a dark complexion, an African-American young lady who says that she doesn't understand why she's looked to in so many ways as ugly, you have to understand that now, on top of these definitions, moral responsibility and morality has been put on top of physical features. How do you put a moral function on a physical feature? So tell me, what is good hair? Well, from my understanding of these definitions, the idea of having good hair is the exact opposite of another group having bad hair. So when we begin to speak of what's good hair, it has to be straight. It has nothing to do with the functional features of what happened to hair and what it's meant to do. Let alone us talking scientifically about the closer you were born to the equator, the more coarse your hair had to be for survival, and the less that you were away from the equator and the more you were tied into Europe and the weather in Europe, then the hair formed a function. So how do you come up with a morality connection to a physical feature? What is a nose that's not attractive? The flatter nose is looked to be less attractive. So when these things come to light and we understand that what this produces is an inferior thought, which has been taught in our formal education since the idea of the creation of Negro schools in the Deep South and all across the country, from the very beginning in the northeast part of our country, all the way down to the idea of the remnants of the transatlantic slave trade. Well, it would be very difficult, because I'm wise enough to realize it'd be very difficult to go from being subhuman and a slave to 1865 to 1866 and beyond for those things to change overnight. So we're wise enough to realize that. And that's why we're discussing this, because it has to be put on the table. Now, we're putting this on the table in what we call a historical manner. So we would ask you to research these things that I'm talking about, these definitions. And then we'll find out if I am indeed correct. And how about the long-lasting effects of the crisis of identity? How our young students, how in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education, Mr. Kenneth B. Clark's dial test, where our children, black children, called the doll that looked like them, that looked exactly like them, ugly. Those are learned behaviors. Now, how do you learn to call yourself ugly when we claim as America to be all God's children? Then we talk about the idea of melanin. Scientifically speaking, dominant and recessive. We understand that European blood can't create that Asian blood. Dominant and recessive. We understand that Asian blood cannot create that, what we know as the indigenous population here blood. We know for a fact that indigenous population, scientifically speaking, can't create what we know as our Latino brown brothers and sisters. And we know our brown brothers and sisters cannot, dominant and recessive genes, create that black man and woman. But that black man and woman can create each color of the spectrum. And it's proven in the likeness when you go everywhere. You see the likeness of that black man, that black woman all across the globe. The black man can produce a child that can be black as 1 million midnights, and that same family can create a child that has been termed an albino and be as white as a European, if not whiter, with kinky hair and a flat nose. So when we look scientifically at the idea of the origin of where civilization started, and we look at these particular scientific pieces and we put them all together, we find that the same crowd that has been told that they are ugly for whatever reason, whatever social function it serves, turns out to be the entire group and the group that was created as the original people. There is no question about how our origination started in Africa. So what effect does this produce? Let's go to 1857, Dred Scott, legally, Dred Scott case. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, and I quote him, "A black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect." How many individuals heard that, understood that, translated that, and it became law? It became what we know as a dictum, a societal dictum. How many folks pass those sentiments along to their children? Those are learned behaviors. So when we understand the long-term goals, then we understand those who set the parameters, and it's working without flaw. How can you come from this forced mindset, walk yourself into a public arena and look at this group any other than inferior after you've been fed these lies? So both of these particular populations have been misinformed to no end. Does this create a psychic trauma for those blacks that this particular situation has served so very valiantly? And does it create an iconic whiteness in the group that will continue to control because of these methods? Dr. Bobby E. Wright, the very first black man to graduate the University of Chicago with a PhD in psychology, coined the term menticide, where your mental thought pattern is killed and replaced with a foreign thought pattern that will allow you to look at an enemy as a friend and a friend as an enemy. That is psychic trauma. Psychic trauma in itself is a part of crisis of identity that we have seen, that we've been victim to. A calculated, predetermined deficiency is placed upon that particular group. When we talk about the crisis of identity, we look to the superficial way that Darwinism was used. We look to the idea of what we know to be physical and mental disparities that create a cleavage for inferiority and white superiority. Well, our third president, President Thomas Jefferson, said indeed that blacks were inferior. And the thought that he forwarded was that blacks excrete differently through their kidneys, which gives them a foul odor. So the person that we can look to who did some groundbreaking work on this particular thought is Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. He is the very first black man to graduate Harvard University with a PhD. And I want to be very clear here, this is early Du Bois, but it is indeed groundbreaking at the time when he began to forward these thoughts. And he talked about a crisis of identity. Here then is the dilemma, and it's a puzzling one, I must admit. No Negro who has given earnest thought to the situation of his people in America has failed at some time in life to find himself at these crossroads. Here it is, you all. He's talking about a crisis of identity. It has come to a crossroad. And he continues, has failed to ask himself at some time, what after all am I? Am I American or am I a Negro? That is perplexing for some folks on the side that looks to definitions to bring clarity of death. Yes, this would be confusing. But being through all that we have been through historically here, then I look to answer this question very simply, and I will. And he goes on to say, can I be both? Or is it my duty to cease to be a Negro as soon as possible and be an American? That is in itself a daunting task. Do I give up all that I know about my African blood, which we know I have been cut off, we have been cut off from our earnest understanding of what blackness really is and what it has meant in the history of society? Is it possible to be both Negro and American? Well, we know the term now that we happen to go by, which was not set by us, but it was set for us, is African American. And he goes on to say, if I strive as a Negro, am I not perpetuating the very cleft that threatens and separates black and white America? Another good point, another great question. If I think of myself as one who cannot be a part of white America, then what part of this do I miss out on? What part of this will this hamper my children? He continues, it is not my only possible practical aim, the subduction of all that is Negro in me to be American? Does my black blood place upon me any more obligations to assert my nationality than German, Irish, or Italian blood would? This comes from his occasional papers for all of you historians and those who want to do research on Dr. W.E. Du Bois. This is 1897 from occasional papers. Now, I want to continue the thought with Dr. W.E. Du Bois, but I want to go to perhaps his most famous writings, The Souls of Black Folks. And for all of you who have not had a chance to get your hands on The Souls of Black Folks, it's great reading. Mandated reading for those of us who want to be considered to be civilized people. And it's just one man's thought. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings. So at the time in 1903, as he's writing this, he's telling you how he feels about looking the way that he looks. He's telling you there's a confusion in his thoughts about being black because he has a very high yellow look. Very much so forwarded by those in his family who were of the Caucasian descent. So he's dealing with the idea of being an American, but he's dealing with the idea of looking at white America to produce his answers. Two warring ideas in one dark body, whose dog strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife. Indeed, the history of the American Negro is indeed this particular thought. When we look at those who have created this question for this particular answer that he's forwarding, the longing, he goes on, the longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wished neither of the older selves to be lost. He does not wish to Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. He does not wish to bleach his Negro blood in the flood of white Americanism, for he believes that Negro blood has yet a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for both man to be Negro and American without being cursed and spit upon. Now, I pose a question to you, for all of you all who happen to be with us right now. Is it possible that the crisis of identity is directly connected to what you see as black on black crime, to what you call a self-hate, a learned behavior where you find it very easy to raise a gun to eliminate or kill or harm someone who looks just like you? That's not natural. Folks naturally gravitate to people who look like them. So it takes a systematic plan to put this in reverse and have one another hate each other over colors, red and blue, to gang bang, when the idea of unity is around us all. Well, I want to go back to what Dr. Bobby E. Wright said. He said, blacks kill blacks because they have never been trained to kill whites. Therefore, it's outside of their experience. Now, I need for all of us to understand that when you look at certain situations for answers, then you look to what is being taught. But as a wise person, you need to look to the teacher and pay more attention to the teacher than you do the student. So when you see the behaviors of blacks here in America, look at from whence they came and look at who has been the teacher and look at the desired outcome. So when you look to some of these things that you see as far as actions, attitudes, and behaviors, make sure that you look at those who forwarded and had the power and the credence to create a masterful program for self-hate. So when you look at the behaviors of black Americans, in some regards, not removing the idea of responsibility, but you're looking at a group of folks who were removed from their parents, natural parents, and been raised by a step-parent. And I'll say this very, very clearly. Raised by not just a step-parent, but a wicked step-parent. A wicked step-parent who has taught us, and Brother Malcolm said it well, the worst thing that the white man taught us was to hate ourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for this very small time that we've had. This information may in no means change your life, but because truth and you are so very important to me, I just thought you ought to know. I remain, with esteem and respect, Frederick Douglass Dixon, a distinguished man of color. Thank you.